Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we've got a panel now to discuss really the place of cult cinema in the 21st century. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions to the panel, then I'm going to throw it over to you guys. So think about what you might want to ask. So just to start off as a sort of couple of general questions for the panel, really. We did have quite a lot of competing definitions of cult there, and it seems to me that over time, how we've thought about cult has changed. What has been the sort of change in the 21st century? What's different about cult now from before?
I'll go first. The world has changed, and the movies in that world have changed with that world and sometimes against that world. I'm not here to say that cult cinema is a reaction to what happens in the world, but it's not inoculated from it either. So I would say it's sort of inevitable that as the world changes and as we change, that these movies change and that we look at them differently as well. The language that we use to talk about movies has changed for the better. Joe Jackson would say it's changing, but we still have a long way to go. This is from the song The Real Man. And so I think cult cinema in that sense is a reflection of many media, with the exception that it always talks a little harsher and a bit more controversial, perhaps sometimes a bit more juvenile than other films that also sit in the world.
Thank you, Ernest. I mean, I'd just add something briefly to that. So I think there remain multiple and sliding definitions, but what is, I think, the constant, the necessary constant, is like a political underpinning and the requirement to put on the map, whether it's at a regional or a global level, communities and films are important, So I wasn't going to say this, but Ernest, you've made me think, your reference to Iranian film, and I really want to just say we've got to be doing a lot more to promote Iranian film, regardless of how they're defined. And it's fascinating because their definitions of cult are much closer to melodrama, right? And so that's interesting. But why I raise that is even before the current turmoil at the moment, and I would argue you can't bomb people into democracy. That never works. But there's been a recent wave of really powerful, important Iranian films that are often using melodrama techniques to make serious examinations of gender and sexuality. And again, the filmmakers take their life in their hands when completing this. I could give a couple of examples here. So films that we've promoted at Cine Excess, for instance, at the end of Evan, which is about a trans character who's misled to go to a Tehran household for a sex change operation, and very dark circumstances emerge from there. And it was told in such a brilliant way. And I said, well, this is an incredible piece of cinema. And the filmmakers said, kind of it is and it isn't, because it's a real trans performer. If we revealed the identity of that trans performer, they'd be killed. Or another example is Gol Nisa, a film of gender brutality in the Iranian brickwork factory. The filmmaker and his wife were expelled from Iran. They live in Newcastle now, right? And so you need to be promoting Gol Nisa there. So I think what's not changed is the importance of political statements through these films.
Iain, Becky.
Will I go first? Yeah, okay. So I think there's a weird tension in cult in the 21st century, because on the one hand, as you both said, there's a much kind of broader conception of cult. It's constantly evolving and changing, responding to changes in technology, responding in the world and the politics around us. At the same time, there's many people who argue that cult is dead, that cult is a historical phenomenon, that it is the kind of midnight movie, or it adapts with VHS. But there's lots of people who feel like cult at a certain point becomes almost a meaningless term, because it becomes so broad. It becomes a term of marketing. It becomes a term that has become divorced from that initial kind of concrete, specific historical moment. But yet, for me, I think the most exciting things are when we're paying attention to how cult is evolving, and are thinking about exactly this question of what constitutes a cult film in the context of Iranian cinema, and thinking seriously about who is getting to define cult in that context, and what a cult cinema and fandom means. What are the elements that we want to hold on to, especially, I think, in that political context?
Yeah, I mean, you guys have all spoken so well about this. I mean, I think one of the things that stands out to me is that cult. About 10 years ago, when I first kind of taught a course on cults, there were still some students who kind of weren't familiar with this term at all. And that really is not the case anymore, particularly in a Western context, at least. And I suppose in a way, now that cult has kind of been established and accepted and kind of brought into academia and all of those things, that now it's kind of unsurprising that there's opportunities to develop those ideas and to change them. And I think the other thing that's quite interesting to me is that there's generational aspects to this as well. The films that my students think of as cult are not the same films that I think of as cult necessarily. So, you know, and I'm assuming for the generation before me, it was the same as well, you know, so that there's always this opportunity to kind of build on what's come before, but then challenge it as well. Because it's already been established.
Can I ask, for instance, with your students, what do they consider to be cult that you might not, or vice versa?
So for me, I mean, my students, particularly at the moment, are kind of predominantly East Asian, and also predominantly female. And what I've realized from them is that, especially in an East Asian context, you know, as kind of Iain was alluding to in his talk, cult really doesn't mean much. That word itself doesn't really have like a neat translation, so it's something that they kind of struggle with, and their approach often to come into it is to think about films that are fairly mainstream genre style films. And then among the kind of the more, you know, the British, the UK students, what I'm seeing is a lot of kind of films from their youth, reclaiming films from their youth, so like kind of teen movies and things like that, which in a way is actually following a tradition, I would say, of cult in general. You know, the films that I love from the 50s and the 60s, the sci-fi and the horror films, you know, they got recuperated in the 70s and 80s by the people who had been children in the 50s and 60s. So in a way, they're kind of following those trends, but it is this new batch of movies that are coming out in response to that.
Just to pick up on something that was alluded to, I think, throughout all of the talks, or was in the background really, is technological change. How has technological change changed the way either we engage with cult film or even what cult film means? Ernest?
Yeah, massively, I would say. But not in a way that new technologies have replaced old technologies of consumption and distribution. They're still around, and they remain, maybe not numerically dominant, but they remain as a sort of pinnacle, as a coat hanger, as a model, as a totemic example is your 35mm distribution of a film that travels from theater to theater. That is still there, even though fewer and fewer films actually make that world tour that way. Next to that, all those other technological changes, so whether it's YouTube, the internet, online distribution. We have a film in the book, Skinamarink, which did receive a theatrical release. I believe it was screened here at Offscreen, if not last year, the year before, or the year before that. The film was from 2023, it can't be that long ago. But the film was initially leaked, and I put that between air quotes, online, and you could watch at least good chunks of it on YouTube before the film got its proper release. So you have your technological intervention right there. That's not to the detriment of the film. I would argue that a film such as Skinamarink benefits from that type of semi-accidental distribution, because it looks like it's a home movie that shouldn't belong in a movie theater, so it fits it. I don't think it was done deliberately, but it makes a neat narrative. So in that way, the technological changes and interventions become part and parcel of cult reception, which is essential.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to that. I mean, first of all, you know, we tend to, I call it with students, avoid the curse of the now, the idea that everything is now liberated, everything that went before, you know, is somehow repressive, and to be, you know, these are, I think the term is difficult histories that we need to engage with. And there's a presumption that technology means that everything is emancipated, that the opportunity for the filmmaker is enlarged. If you look at an example like Alien the Hunt, you know, this guy's film just disappeared into a Netflix library, and as soon as it disappears into a Netflix library, your festival run ends, so you can't promote it on the festival circuit. So it really kind of kills your film, in a way, this opportunity. So it's like, I just wonder if new technology is the new exploitation mode rather than the new emancipation mode, point number one. Secondly, I was interested in what Ernest said about, you know, films that are leaked and how technology is subverted. There's another example in the book of The Revenge of Michael Myers, which is one, people may have seen this, it was one of the last sequels of the original Halloween run, and at one level the least successful, but the reason why we included it is there was a mythical producer's cut that was made that was better than I think I saw this at Biff, and I thought, God, this doesn't make any sense at all. And the reason was it was cut with recut with test audiences. So fans started doing their own version on the internet, and in the end, the distributors had to re-release the film with the producer's cut. Final comment, I think we talk about technology, but there's another really interesting trend here, which is the re-emergence of analog, right, and analog technology. So right now, Offscreen has a season running of public information films, which I'd urge people to have a look. They're really interesting. And what we noticed at last year's Cine Excesses, we had films submitted on VHS. Never happened before. I don't mean student films, professional films shot on VHS, professional films shot on Super 8. And we had one film that was a collage of 300 public information films recut into a blaxploitation narrative. So I think when we talk of technology, we're looking at forward-thinking technology with the challenges involved, but this undertow of analog resurgence, which I think is, watch this space, there's more work to be done there.
I mean, firstly, just to kind of pick up on that, actually, we were talking about this a bit over breakfast, that I do think, especially among the younger generations, they kind of miss some of the physical, tangible, you know, ability to pick out a DVD or a VHS and actually hold it. And it feels very different browsing the shelves of like a DVD collection than it does scrolling through like a Netflix selection. And I think that there are certainly, you know, we see that with the rise of vinyl and all those kind of things, like a kind of desire to reclaim or to kind of return back to some of that more tangible elements of things. I think one of the big changes that I've been kind of grappling with technology is that on the one hand, it feels like everything is so easily available to us now. I mean, there are films that I remember during my PhD, you know, spending like £35 for a second-hand VHS, you know, of a copy of some random film that now is, you know, there's 10 versions of it on YouTube. So in one sense, we have so much more access to all these things, but I also think it's really difficult to find them if you don't know what you're looking for, because there is so much. So I'm always quite fascinated, like, how do people find these random examples of things if they haven't specifically known to go and look for them? And I don't really, especially as someone who's not on social media at all, which may be part of the problem, that it can be quite difficult to know that these things exist out there to be found. So that's one of the things, I guess, for me that I find interesting.
Yeah, and I guess just following on from that, like, yeah, this idea of cult dying is sometimes attributed to, yeah, internet culture and like the algorithm, that cult cinema, like, yeah, people are kind of nostalgically harking back and trying to recapture that kind of earlier authentic moment, that material object, because there's a feeling of loss within our contemporary moment of kind of Netflix algorithmic culture, in which cult is just a category that you're kind of scrolling through, rather than, yeah, seeking out that VHS tape, trying to track it down, finally reaching the unattainable object.
It conquers the world.
But then, in other ways, technology, I think, facilitates these new evolving forms of cult, like the filmmakers in Uganda, the Wakaliwood filmmakers who did Who Killed Captain Alex. Like, yeah, you've got it's digital technology that's facilitating all of that. Like the cameras that they're using, the VCDs and DVDs that are influencing the films that they're making, and then the YouTube clips of that film that circulate online that lead to the film playing at festivals and like that becoming a kind of movement. And so, yeah, it's digital technology that it's the root of this kind of new global form of cult cinema. So even if it, on one level, it's dying and we're harking back to some earlier moment, it's also something that is evolving in new and exciting ways.
Becky, can I ask you? I'll start with you, but this is for everybody. And this is maybe a impossible question to answer. It may be a controversial question, but is there an algorithm? Can you create a cult film? Because we've talked about that cult film maybe is used as a kind of marketing term, maybe a little bit too much, and it kind of dilutes maybe the term cult, perhaps. But is there an algorithm? Can you go away and create? Can we tomorrow go and make a cult film?
I mean, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? I would say that you can certainly try, and you can hit all of the markers, all of those kind of formal characteristics of, what makes a film cult, the gore, the intertextuality, the irony, the loose ends, all of those things. You can put all of those in your film and aim to appeal to a cult audience, but ultimately it's kind of up to the audience whether the film becomes cult or stays cult. So it kind of comes down to the audience at the end. And I think there's, especially at the moment, now that cult has become this kind of marketable category, there are films that are kind of being consciously made to aim to appeal to cult tastes. But whether they, in a year or 5 or 10 years' time, will feature in 100 cult films, this time it's Personal Part 12, is another question. And I suppose there's other things, again, one of the films that I think maybe as like a really recent example, Hundreds of Beavers. I don't know if anyone's encountered it. But that kind of is interesting because it clearly was aimed at a culty kind of market, but also that the practices around it were quite consciously encouraging a cult audience to form through it. So kind of working on a midnight movie kind of, exhibition platform and things like that. So yeah, my rambly way of saying yes and no, but ultimately if the audience rejects it, and I think often in the audience, if it feels too self-conscious, if it feels too deliberate, they're more likely to reject it. And then it only has the potential and failure to be cult, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, and there's tons of examples of that, and the oldest one is Snakes on a Plane, which was it essentially meant the end of New Line Cinema, which had a career in having films that became cult films, Nightmare on Elm Street, etc., etc. New Line Cinema started as a distributor, so they learned what the cult film meant, and then tried to fabricate it, and essentially Snakes on a Plane ended that. I was in touch with the super fan of The Room, which is one of the most accidental cult films because it's a literal waste of time. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. It's a brilliant film. I screen it every year in class. We use thousands of spoons. But Michael Rousselet, who sometimes accompanies The Room and cheerleads the audience, tried to make a cult film. It's called Dude Bro Party Massacre 3. And it has a chainsaw and a rabbit in it, so there's some cult tokens in there. It never reached an audience at all. One poster was made, and maybe 2 people have seen the film, including myself. So I would say it's really up to the audience. You can hit all the numbers, but if the audience feels that something's being whipped together and fabricated, it's like, this is not good cooking, I won't eat this. I won't eat this meal. Regardless of the fact that films and franchises such as John Wick or Fast and Furious actually use the word cult in their own text. They say, oh, Fast and Furious 10, they say, it's like a cult, isn't it? It's like, no, it isn't. No, you're not. You're insulting me. So it ultimately does boil down to the audience.
I mean, very briefly, just to echo everything that colleagues have said so far, and I think well, first of all, I mean, yeah, Snakes on a Plane is a pet hate for Ernest because it comes up a lot. People used to say the same about trauma movies, that they were, too committed to creating a cult film. But I thought there was something more genuine about Troma. They were low budget, mobile crews, lots of people in different below the line creative roles. So there was something interesting there. We're in a sort of curious era of cult by committee at the moment. And what I mean by that is it could be an algorithm, or you get these very curious bedfellows with, say, 5 or 6 production companies coming together, understandably for financial reasons, to make a cult film. And they're interesting because they largely don't work. And you almost think if there was 1 or 2 of you, that actually would have been a great cult film. But because of the economics, they never really work and they don't find an audience. But the failures are as interesting as the hits. Yeah. So who knows?
Yeah, and just very quickly, it makes me think of Susan Sontag's work on camp, because she talks about the distinction between naive and deliberate camp. That when it's naive, there's something more satisfying about it. That when it's deliberate, it's not as pleasurable. And I think there are some cases, like I agree that Troma is deliberate camp, and also I love watching Troma films. But yeah, it's like the difference between a Plan 9 from Outer Space and a Sharknado. There's just something about that kind of pre-designed form of cult and camp, which is just inherently less satisfying than something where they're attempting something, and you can see the kind of the ambition, you can see that kind of beautiful kind of handmade qualities, the individual expression, rather than a kind of cynical attempt to just appeal to a particular audience.
All this talk of audience, I'm going to come to the audience now. This is seamless linking. I'm going to come to the audience for questions now. And like some terrible boy band singer that's gone to seed, I'm going to stand up from my chair. Any questions? Anyone got any questions? There's always a horrendous pause for a while before people are brave enough. But any questions?
Bollywood and cult, what do you mean?
Okay, yeah, I guess I'll answer that one. I think Bollywood's fascinating with cult cinema because, as I was mentioning earlier, like India makes more films every year than any other country. And yet there's often a debate as to, what would constitute a cult film in the context of Indian cinema. Occasionally some people will suggest a film like Sholay because it's been rewatched so many times, it's such a kind of important classic. But then whenever I speak to scholars of Indian cinema, to them that does not mean cult. Like to them that's such a mainstream blockbuster hit that everyone enjoys. That is not the same kind of film as a Rocky Horror Picture Show or a Pink Flamingos. And so for some Indian scholars, it's directors more like Kanti Shah, who did the film Gunda, which has been, there's websites devoted to it as being like the Indian Plan 9 from Outer Space, so bad it's good classic, but it's a cult film largely within the Hindi-speaking audience in India and the diaspora. Like it hasn't really crossed over. Unlike lots of other kind of international cult films that become cult when they, play in the West. It's really just a cult film amongst the domestic and diasporic audience. I would say there are cult films in India, and there are websites, like there's a Facebook community called I Love Trashy Hindi Movies, in which people just play clips of cult Indian films, and yet so few of those films actually reach an international kind of non-Hindi speaking audience.
I'll just add to that if I could and say a really good place to start is the Ramsey brothers, who held sway as like the filmmaking family for cult and horror cinema, and they did some fantastic Indian reduxes of international horror hits. One of the fascinating things, there's 2 observations here, is the Netflixification of Indian supernatural cinema. So what you find is that Netflix, either through sort of purchasing sort of library titles, are actually producing films now, very, very involved in that market. But there's a more interesting sub-industry of Indian cult film that are looking at social issues using supernatural imagery. So a number of these films, for instance, are looking at the concept of witch hunting in Indian society, and they often say it could be charity or UNESCO funded, to raise awareness of different sort of social or gender issues, but they're using genre imagery as well. So it's almost like there was the classic Ramsey Brothers style of Indian cult film and iterations of that, but there's now a social themed version of Indian cinema as well that's worthy of exploration.
Very much so. And I'd like to add to that the term Bollywood is one that I've struggled with for a long time, and its association with cult. When Jamie Sexton and I put together the Cult Companion, we asked scholars of Indian cinema about Bollywood and our intention to maybe associate that with interpretations of film as cult films. And every single author that we contacted refused to contribute. They said, no, these things are completely different. There's no overlap. It's been on my mind ever since. I had a PhD student who studied internet platforms and consumption of films through streaming in India, and she made an important point where she said, we need to think of the consumption of film in India as a different audience configuration, where the notion of the family is much more important. And I mentioned Richmond as a suburb of Vancouver. There's another suburb called Surrey, where there's a large South Asian population. If you go there, these households are intergenerational, so their media consumption is also intergenerational, meaning it's not your middle-class white male between 18 and 25, maybe, but they're surrounded by their grandmother, their aunt, and their uncle at the same time, and that obviously influences their pattern of consumption. As a result of that, I don't think it's wrong necessarily to also include films such as Sholay, at least in the discussion, of films such as DDLJ, which is another one of those endlessly rewatched films. It's an uneasy association, for sure, but we might as well try and include it into the conversation. We'll see what happens.
Any other questions? Any further questions? Marvellous.
Thank you for your question. Thank you very much for everything. I have a twofold question. The cult and the future. This is the general one. And one more specific is, considering current situation in the world, are you expecting an explosion, considering the reality we are surrounded by? Thank you.
Are you asking about what would be the future of cult cinema given the warlike situation that we find ourselves in? That's a tough one. I do notice that the element of war and warfare is one that is on the mind of filmmakers these days. We see more presentations and representations of weaponry. You could, in the narrowest definition of cult cinema, say we only have a couple of assault weapons. It's a gun and it's a knife, and that defines a slasher movie, and a couple of vigilante subgenres, and that was it. Maybe the chainsaw. Well, of course, the chainsaw as well. And now I do think that there's an extension of attention towards different types of weaponry. Whether that leads to a subgenre of, I don't know, warfare exploitation or something like that, I have absolutely no idea. But it is something that I've noticed. It's the presence of different types of rockets, missiles, etc. in films.
I think, regrettably, we're in a golden age for this material, and the regret comes from the link between inequality and suffering and the need for communities to speak. So I'm sort of, inevitably when you're at amazing events like Offscreen, all of the conversations with the programmers are what the hot territories right now for movies. And so, we mentioned Iran. I think Iran is doing some, even before recent things, that are doing amazing movies, a very broad definition of how we redefine cult. South America as well, and South American territories are doing some incredible things. A big shout out to a new movie that's going to be on the circuit. I think it's already on the circuit, called Don't Come Out, which is a South American film about LGBT paranoias in those territories and what happens when people do come out and how their families respond to that. So there's warlike activity here, but there's also, across these different territories, this desire for expression and inequality, and it's coming out of a particularly toxic period, which is why these films are so powerful right now.
I'm gonna lighten the tone, I guess. I'm kind of just thinking off the top of my head. I mean, one of the things about cult film is this kind of relationship to guilty pleasures and like a sense of escapism, and that maybe this is also a way of, that when the world is really difficult and when everything is horrible, maybe we just want to watch some nice, trashy, stupid, totally bonkers film that has nothing to do with anything, but just gives us a bit of an escape for 90 minutes or so. I wouldn't apply to all cult films, obviously, but I think certainly there is a whole body of cult movies that allow us to escape out of this world in a positive way. So, yeah, I guess that would be my very vague thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, like, for me, part of the appeal of cult cinema, but also just cinema generally, is to try and break down some of those national and cultural borders and the kind of the justifications and rationales that are given for these kind of endless kind of wars and interventions. So part of the appeal of cult cinema, and especially from a kind of global perspective, is to try and build that more cosmopolitan engagement, that kind of openness to other cultures, even if sometimes it is based on elements from those cultures that we don't yet fully understand or we find culturally different. Like, I think there's the potential there through cinema to kind of break down some of those barriers and create a broader understanding. So I'm still hopeful about the potential of cinema and cult cinema, even within the context of the horrifying situation that the world is in.
If I briefly may, there's something in the book we mention, and you mentioned it as well, Iain, that cult cinema often seems to problematize the issue of nationhood. And right now we live in a couple of years where the notion of the nation is really foregrounded. I live in Canada. I was going to wear a T-shirt that says "Canada is not for sale." That was never going to be an issue until very recently, and it puts the chapter I wrote in your book on Indigenous First Nation Canadian cinema argues that notion of the nation state of Canada is superfluous, and yet here we are, and it's front and central again. And the only other thing I spoke a little too soon. There is a cycle of films, and one of them is actually in the book, about communities and individuals constantly on the move, in between zones, in between communities. The film is called Drifter. It's a Brazilian film. It's about 3 homeless people who are incredibly philosophical about the situation they find themselves in. It doesn't have a narrative. It just follows these 3 characters, and in a way it's a documentary. But that sense of drifting is something that I see more and more in films that are called cult today.
Any other questions? I'm going to ask, if anyone, have a think if you do have a question. I'm going to ask you a question that you may or may not be able to answer, but are there any films you think which are sort of on the margins of being cult but are not quite cult yet, or you think might become cult films in the future?
I have one. It's been suggested to me by one of my students, Zichin Liang, who's from China. And I asked her when she was mine, I said, what is your Chinese cult film? And she mentioned a film called Tiny Times. It's not a very good film. It's about 5 young adult women in China who are obsessed with fashion. They have a fashion fetish, which expresses itself particularly towards glassware. So they're glass snobs. So there you go.
Okay.
I would say I'm aware Offscreen this year are doing like a Spanish cult film under Franco, and again back to politics and thinking about sort of South America. 2 Argentinian brothers are coming out with amazingly good stuff. They're not only filmmakers themselves; these are the Onetti brothers. But they've got a distribution company that's doing transnational horror and cult. It's called Black Mandala, the company, and they're financing a lot of co-productions in really interesting territories. And they did a fantastic film that not everyone liked it, but I liked it, called 1978, which is, it did the festival circuit last year, and some of the colleagues liked it, some of them didn't. It's basically set in the Argentinian military regime in 1978 when they won the World Cup, and they used that to hoover up all the left-wing activists. So the fact that everyone was at the football match, they thought, right, we'll clean house. And in the film, brilliantly, they go to the wrong house. So rather than picking up left-wing activists, they pick up a satanic cult instead, and they just bring down the whole military regime. So I thought that was great, but the Onetti brothers are doing consistently good stuff.
So I was at Fright Fest a couple of weeks ago. They have a kind of Glasgow offshoot of their festival, and the last film of the weekend was a film called Carmadonna, which is directed by the writer of a Serbian film, which, if you're familiar with a Serbian film, it's in the sequel, but it's kind of known for being, really extreme, very difficult viewing. When I heard this, I was a bit apprehensive, but actually Carmadonna was a lot of fun. Still gory and all of those kind of things, but certainly not as kind of unpleasant as a film like a Serbian film might be. And I would be curious to see where that goes, or whether that goes. So it's basically about a pregnant woman who gets a phone call from somebody saying that they're God, like a Buddha figure, and that she needs to kill a bunch of people that this God figure can't reach, or he will harm her child. And it just kind of follows through that. But it's kind of fun. It was really gory. It was kind of interesting. Has the religious connection that often kind of underpins various kind of cult films. Watching it in a cinema with a whole crowd of horror fans, we all had a blast and really enjoyed it, but it'll always be interesting to see whether part of our enjoyment was from that communal experience, and whether that might survive, in a more individual viewing context. So I guess Carmadonna, keep an eye out for it, I suppose, and then you can see for yourself whether it might make the grade.
And I guess one for me would be, there's a director in Ghana, Samuel Nkansa, sometimes called Ninja, who has made very kind of low budget, trashy kind of films that kind of go viral online, and so 2016 was one of the ones that he made, but more recently did African Kung Fu Zombies, and very deliberately kind of plays with the conventions of cult cinema in quite a knowing way, has collaborated with Andrew Leavold, the Australian documentary maker, and so I feel like there's potential in a lot of African cult cinema that's being produced right now in the last few years, to really kind of break out and reach a global audience. It has circulated, a lot of these films have circulated largely as like short clips on YouTube, but when films like Who Killed Captain Alex start playing festivals and the feature films themselves start reaching a broader audience, I think that's, I feel like we're almost on a tipping point there.
Thank you. Any final questions?
Can you say thank you to Chuck Norris?
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about Chuck Norris actually when that news broke. So I think in many respects a cult film icon, and someone who really popularised martial arts and action cinema. So I don't think necessarily everyone agreed with his politics, but that didn't prevent us from recognising him as a great contributor to the field. And Ernest, I'm sure, is the next Chuck Norris.
Sorry, I'm what?
The next Chuck Norris.
Yeah, right. And Chuck Norris did play an important role in the way his figure was used as a motor, an engine in the memification of several ways in which we present idols, stars, and icons. Jean-Claude Van Damme plays a role in that as well. Often the two are pitched against each other. If Jean-Claude Van Damme stands on 2 Volvo trucks, Chuck Norris can stand on 2 airplane wings at the same time. So yes, it sounds a bit silly, but I do think those processes do play a pioneering role, and Chuck Norris is definitely part of that. Not to mention masculinity in the 1980s, that sort of embodies it before Schwarzenegger came around and all.
Yeah, I actually did a presentation at Offscreen in about 5-6 years ago. I think it was a sort of Canon, I think it was a series of Canon films, and it was called Chuck Norris Didn't Dial the Wrong Number, You Answered the Wrong Phone. And it speaks to the fact that with Chuck Norris, the fact you have all of these jokes, you have another sort of life with Chuck Norris, extra textual outside of the films. There was an article today on the BBC website actually that was talking about how the number of people who haven't ever seen a Chuck Norris film, but they know who he is and they know something about him, and they have a caricature in their head of Chuck Norris. And I think he was able somehow to be a huge part of public consciousness, even if people hadn't seen his work, which I think is quite an achievement. And again, might not agree with his politics, but actually as a cultural figure, that's a really significant impact, I think. Anyone else got any final questions? If not, we'll bring things to a close. Any final questions? Okay, listen, I just want to thank Ernest, Xavier, Becky, and Iain. I'm afraid that I'm going to forget people's names when I do that. But a big thank you to all of our speakers today. As I always say, a big thank you to you, the audience. You know, we really appreciate you being here. It's nothing without you guys. If you're around, come back and watch Hard Boiled tonight as well. But a big thank you from all of us, and hopefully we will see you in the bar, the most important place at the festival.